All right, so we're going to move this train out the station. You don't even have to put your seatbelt on because it's not even going to be a bumpy ride today. You know, Michelle, we've had some bumpy rides in 10 years. But this ain't even going to be a bumpy ride. This is going to be a juicy ride, all right? A juicy ride. So no seatbelt required. The topic on the table is My Juicy Rebirth. A Journey to Healing the Feminine Through Pleasure and Sacred Process by first-time published author, Ms. LaTonya Taylor.
The Robert Wesley Branch Show, a roundtable of wisdom where people from all across the planet, from all walks of life, and from all religious and sacred traditions convene for spiritual conversation.
Chapter 3, Why Juicy? Being in personal possession of yourself, your shadow, and your light is to be awakened, turned on, and juicy. The context of being juicy conjures the experience of biting into a ripe piece of fruit, and just as you bite into it, other juices and flavors are released, squirting its deliciousness inside and outside of your mouth. This fruit leaves your hands, mouth, and maybe your clothes with evidence of this explosion of nature's sappy, sweet essence all over the one who partakes. Juicy evokes a sense of gratitude for being the recipient of all who get the abundance contained behind this outer layer, not to mention how it energizes you. Juicy is an energy or a power like getting juice when a car battery died, or electric power lines that give us lights in our homes and offices. Pleasure has this type of power of the fruit, the nutrient from the fruit, and the energetic boost to generate or regenerate our cells. Sensuality is powerful in this way. We have been conditioned to respect it or fear it. Many Western women have forgotten how to use this as a service to their spirit and their healing.
You are listening to the Robert Wesley Branch Show. Inspiration, wisdom, encouragement, and empowerment.
Born and raised in Vicksburg, Mississippi, Ms. LaTonya Taylor self-identifies as a purpose, pleasure, passion counselor. And some of y'all know her as Reverend Pussy. A word about Vicksburg, Mississippi, though, brothers and sisters. In my 53 years around the sun, I have only met one other person from Vicksburg, Mississippi, and that was the late fashion designer, Mr. Patrick Kelly, who was born there in Vicksburg on September 24th, 1954. And as we are recording this on September 23rd, happy birthday tomorrow to Brother Patrick, who I met way back in the day in 1987 at the Washington Post building, where I was covering a story for my college newspaper. Brother Patrick was in Washington, D.C. showing his collection. I believe it was a spring collection. And as a student reporter, I was writing it all down. Brother Patrick made a big mark for himself in Paris fashion circles, and what always excited me about watching his evolution was how unapologetically black he was in his climb to the top of the European ready-to-wear clothing industry. He also enjoyed quite a bit of success here at home in the United States. Brother Patrick left his body on January 1st, 1990. I remember that too. It's the first day of the new year, January 1st, 1990, and his remains are interred in a Paris cemetery to this very day. So he was one of those brothers who went to Paris and made his mark, much like James Baldwin and others that we know, honor, and celebrate to this very day. Brother Patrick Kelly. Now, back to My Juicy Rebirth. A Journey to Healing the Feminine Through Pleasure and Sacred Process by Ms. LaTonya Taylor. Page 79, Chapter 4, Pleasing God, ? On my coaching days, inside of our Juicy Spirit process, I am met with private messages that no matter how open and safe the process is, a sister will share a secret she has labeled dark. You know, the dark secret that has a hold on you. I met the truth of a sister who had been diagnosed with herpes and felt stained and somewhat disabled to express her sensuality freely because of this diagnosis. It moved me so deeply to remember the scarlet letter. So many women are no longer wearing it on the outside, but now wear the scarlet letter on the inside. This inbox to me was a first step to her freedom. It was like entering into the confessional If you grew up Catholic, like I did, then you'll remember how you enter into the small box with two doors, one for you and the other for the priest on the other side. Between you and the little bench was a screen so that you can talk to the priest. This particular morning, through several unplanned hours of coaching, I wrote to her and then to many other women. I researched more medical information from my favorite doctor, Dr. Christiane Northrup, who addressed this herpes issue directly as a medical lie that it's not reversible on her radio show. You see, when you show up, the healing balm shows up to greet you when you enter into your shadow or question it. I offer this to every woman who has stamped herself with a scarlet letter. The scarlet letter energy is the secret shame that gets stored away in the vault of our womb and is covered over with perfectionism, performance, persecution, and paralysis. It matters not what your verb is that turns you into a noun other than a goddess. Be it the abortion, multiple abortions, STDs, poor choices, teen pregnancy, infertility, religious sacrifice, and or all of the above. That was an experience. Sister, that is not the total sum of who you are. All right, brothers and sisters, let's get it.
Come on in from your world and listen. He's the same man, same message, same mission. Channeling the cosmos, all mystic and soul. He's bringing the power and sharing the wisdom that never gets old. I'm talking about Robert Wesley Branch. He don't mind taking a chance. Robert Wesley Branch, he's here with his crew. So be well, be encouraged, be inspired every day. Be well, be encouraged, be inspired every day. Hey, hey! It's the Robert Wesley Branch Show.
That's right. I bet you ain't used to hearing a man reading your words from your book, Miss LaTonya Taylor. I bet you ain't used to that.
You know me so well.
Yeah, I said, I bet she ain't heard that like that in a while. I'm so
that's
full.
So good, though.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so full in this moment to have my sister here, to have all my sisters here. And this particular one is a guest today. And I'm really excited about it because I've known her, you, Ms. LaTonya Taylor, for a little over a year now. And you know I'm going to tell this story. We met on a conference call for Fix My Life because we both work on that particular series, and we were on the call and it was lovely. And about an hour and a half later, when creativity is high and we feel like, we know each other a little better, it gets loud and I get loud and my voice pitch raises and I start saying some words. And at one point LaTonya said to me, Robert. All she said was Robert. And it was like, calm down, brother. Calm down. Pull it in, get it together. And I heard that really clearly. And I just calmed down, pulled it in, got it together. Because it was just that voice letting me know that I was probably taking it a little bit too far. And I really appreciated that. This is when I kind of knew that we were going to be brother and sister. That's the way this was going to go. Because I didn't feel bad about that. Like I felt loved in that moment. I hope y'all understand what I'm saying. I felt loved. In that moment. It didn't make me feel like wrong. Can you hear me? Not wrong, but loved. So that's a spirit right there.
Totally get it.
Yeah, you hear me, Michelle? That's a spirit. And I knew when I had that feeling that this was a sister that I wanted to have in my life. And so I appreciate that moment. I appreciate you, Ms. LaTonya Taylor. We're here to talk about your book today, My Juicy Rebirth, A Journey to Healing the Feminine Through Pleasure and Sacred Process by Ms. LaTonya Taylor. It's available on Amazon.com. It's also available at LaTonyaTaylor.com. Now, as we got into the Fix My Life process, and I would see LaTonya regularly, almost every day, for 3 or 4 or 5 months, it just became clear to me that this sister and I knew each other thinking about Sister Erykah Badu in the next lifetime and in the last lifetime, because it was just, you understand? And Judy, and it was the same way before you came, LaTonya. I was telling Michelle how I met Judy through a friend of hers who invited me to a party at Judy's house. Now, I ain't seen that brother since. I ain't seen that brother since that party. And I've known Judy for 33 years. That's some other lifetime stuff right there.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And it was the same way with LaTonya. The more I was around her and watched her and felt the energy from her, it was very clear to me that I've known this sister. You know, we used to sit up on the nose of the Sphinx and watch the sand dunes, you know, long ass time ago. You know what I'm saying? Kicking our feet up watching the sandstorms. You understand?
That's right.
That's what it felt like.
Yes. That day on the telephone, I don't know where that came from when I said your name the way that I did. It was as if something took over my body.
Mm-hmm.
I normally don't do that. And so I was like, oh, LaTonya, but I couldn't help it. So you're so right. Mm-hmm. I knew that I had known you before that day because I loved your energy.
Thank you, sister. The topic on the table is My Juicy Rebirth, a journey to healing the feminine through pleasure and sacred process by first-time published author, Ms. LaTonya Taylor.
That's what I find so beautiful about, well, first of all, about relationships, but I think that, Robert, what you've also hit on is something of a spiritual honing. And even in reading your book, My Juicy Rebirth, you speak about all of these lessons and really the learning that you took yourself through, not only traditional learning, you know, going to various different institutions and things like that, but you always allowed yourself and you constantly kept questioning yourself to have life learning. And I think that's, to me, what really kind of resonates for me in your writing and in your talking about your journey. And that's one of the things I really wanted to have you explain is you talk about in this kind of the first chapter about this integration of spiritual and sensual transformation. And I love that because so many women and so many people don't understand it and don't talk about that. So can you talk to me about that and how you came to that?
Absolutely. I've always been very spiritual person, and I didn't know what it was very young. I didn't know about being empathic. I didn't know about the gift of intuition in the way of knowing certain things and being able to have my senses turned on. There was just a knowing that I had to live with quietly for many years. And then it turned into more of a seeker. Like I went to church with the ladies in my family. I talk a little bit about, you know, my relationship with my mother and really with my mother tribe, because even though I had my mom, I had all these other mothers around me. And so I would go to Catholic church with one, Baptist church with the other. So I grew up spiritually multilingual, well, bilingual at least, for a long time. I went to the Catholic church in the morning with my godmother and met my mother at her church later. And then they all fellowshiped together. So I always had to translate. And what's so funny is Catholics are quiet, and these Baptists would shout and cut up, you know. A lot of times I would go down in the basement, but that was the beginning of me translating the different experiences. And then I became a seeker. I don't know how or what was turned on inside of me, but I remember watching Phil Donahue and the black priest who left the Catholic Church and started to talk about the
Father Stallings.
Identity in
George Stallings.
So that, exactly. And that was the beginning of another awakening. So the spiritual piece came first. And I grew up around all of these turned-on women who were very unapologetic about their sensuality at the time. They were sexy and they knew it. And
interesting.
Even though I was in the South, I never heard a mixed message. So when they got together, they talked shop, big time shop. They were fresh. The ladies in my family are fresh. I just loved it. They would make all the men bashful, whether it be their nephews or the neighborhood guys. They knew if they came into this den where the women were gathered and drinking their champagnes back in the day on a weekend, that they could get interviewed, questioned, anything could go down. And they just were unedited. I never saw a separation of what Pastor Willie Wilson in Southeast D.C. called such a muchness. They weren't so such a much that they had compartmentalized. Because I was a young bride and I got married at 19 years old, I really was not orgasmic with my first husband until well after I left. I mean, I enjoyed sex, and I probably had some accidental orgasms, but I didn't know, even being around all of these sensual women who talk shop, they weren't talking technique. They weren't talking about how to arouse there.
And the brother never asked you if you were orgasmic, right?
No. I didn't have sex with my first husband until we got married, which I talk about in the book.
Yes, you do.
In fact, I remember when I told my mother that I was going to get married, but we had not had sex yet, she said to me, what?
Yeah, okay. Most people don't understand. Right.
You're doing what? And that was in my mind, that was an imprint, because she said, you are buying the cow and you haven't tested the milk.
All right, let's break that down a little bit, though. When you say you didn't have sex with your husband until you got married, are you saying that his penis did not enter your vagina until y'all were married? You certainly saw it. You knew what you were looking at. You knew what you were working with. You know, you might have played around with it a little bit. None of that?
No.
No. You know how I know that? Because this is another thing I would love for you to talk about. When it hit me, where you talked about that good girl complex and how it can block your flow. A good girl's not going to be holding a penis. A good girl ain't going to be looking at it and testing it out. No.
I would actually disagree with you that good girls do a lot of things and they sneak and do it, and they just don't tell anybody about it, and that's the complexity.
I know some of them.
The good girls actually live with a lot of shame, a lot of guilt around activities that they engaged in because of religion. And I was following the religion to the T. So the good girl came later after religion. But for the most part, if you were to ask somebody in my family, they would probably look at me crazy saying I was a good girl, because I always questioned, I always had a lot of lip, I always was different.
So when you say you were following the religion, at that point you mean a Catholic girl. You were trying to be a good Catholic girl.
I was a good Muslim girl. Remember, I was in the Nation of Islam.
Oh, Robert, let me tell you something about Catholic girls. We some sneaky, we some bad girls, okay? I was raised Catholic, baby. Okay?
That uniform has seen some work.
The baddest thing on the box. Okay?
LaTonya brings up Father George Stallings, and I know you will remember no Pockets in the Shroud, this sermon that you and I went to.
Well, you know, I made a big deal when he first came out, and he was over there at Howard University. He held his first service at Howard University Law School, and I was like, I got you to come start coming over to his services. I got my mother to start coming to his services.
Well, I'm raising it because you actually had me join his church when he left St. Augustine and had what was called Imani Temple, African American Catholic congregation. I joined that church, and I wasn't raised Catholic. I was raised a Baptist boy. All right, but he was so charismatic, and the message was so.
He was very charismatic.
Very charismatic.
You remember him jumping off the stage and running around the church, Robert?
I remember a lot about Father Stallings, a lot of which I don't really want to talk about in this moment. But I was only raising his name to say that there was a sermon that he preached that you and I attended, and it was called No Pockets in the Shroud. And we referred to that for years and years. And in that sermon, he said something that seared into my heart. And he said, listen, brothers and sisters, you're either helping with the healing or you are working with the wounded. And I was like, that's it.
Right.
It's simple. You're either helping with the healing, and I have found that 30-some years later to be very true. You're either helping with the healing or you're working with the wounding. It's that simple.
You're right.
No Pockets in the Shroud. George Stallings.
No, it's true. That's true.
So, LaTonya, the reason why... Well, we're going to get back to it. The reason why I interjected Catholicism was because I know that you were a part of the Nation of Islam, but I thought we were talking about a much earlier point in your life where you were raised as a Catholic and a Baptist.
First of all, my father chose Catholicism. My mother remained Baptist. I actually have no memory of my father ever going to the Catholic Church. For all my life, I went to the Catholic Church with other people. My sister, godmother, neighbor, and Catholic Church is over in an hour.
Was your father raised Catholic, LaTonya?
No, my father wasn't raised Catholic. My grandmother was Seventh-day Adventist at some point in her life. Oh, wow. But he was a Baptist. He was Baptist for the most part, as far as I know.
So why do you think it was so important for him that you be in the Catholic faith?
I don't know, because we never had a conversation about it. My mother just said that was something that he chose. And
interesting.
So
Very interesting.
They followed suit with that.
Very
and then after that, I would go home with my godmother, and the church was right around the street, our neighborhood street. And so I would just go to the church, meet my mom at church, really to go play, to go play with my friends that went to her church.
So you were about to bring us, LaTonya, into your Nation of Islam experience. How did that come about?
I went to school at Southern University in Baton Rouge, and I was sitting outside the business building one day, and I heard a guy talking this talk, right? Mind you, I had heard Father Stalling. This was the closest thing to what I had heard before that turned on a light. And that's what started my journey. But when I started that journey, it was not with the Nation of Islam under Minister Louis Farrakhan. It was under somebody else.
Okay.
I started to study. I tested a lot of what they were saying. For some reason, I was into the Bible and all of that when I first got to college. Somebody had told me if you read the Bible from cover to cover, you were going to heaven. So I don't know why that thing was activated in me. I had started reading, but then when I started talking to them, I had a whole different understanding. And I basically joined the Nation within about, I think, the second semester. So when I came back to Southern after a break, I was pretty much in the Nation by then. In the Nation, you don't date. You court for marriage. Period.
That's right.
And you don't court a long period of time. If a courtship lasts more than 3 months, the officials of the Nation of Islam usually are going to have a meeting with that couple.
And aren't you chaperoned even during the courtship?
Ideally, but you know what? I found that the mosques down south had time on their hands to care about all that. But when you go into the bigger cities,
right,
there was a lot of loopholes when you go into bigger cities. So I met him at a meeting. I was still in school at Southern, and basically we got married. So we didn't even court that long.
That's when I was reading about the good girl complex. I wasn't thinking it of kind of literal. I kind of think it as a spiritual and literal a little bit literal at the same time. But it's where you really kind of block yourself and you keep yourself from really allowing your body to tell your heart that it's okay to be this full woman of pleasure. I really appreciated that when you talked about it called me to become juicy, rather personally dehydrated by old thought forms that kept my good girl complex blocking my flow. And so it was that sentence that resonated with me, because I feel like oftentimes my good girl complex is built up of the things that not only society has said, but things that my parents have said and experiences that I've had. And so, therefore, when it comes to interweaving my sensuality with my sexuality, with my spirituality, I don't let the two integrate.
So that reflects a different phase of my life. Let's keep it real. 19, how much do you know about your womanhood?
Right.
At 19,
Exactly.
you think you know everything in your early 20s.
Right.
That
You just
typically
figuring out what
comes
feels
from
good.
Yeah,
That's right.
Absolutely. Because at 28 years old, that's usually when a woman starts to ask certain questions about that age. And so, of course, by that time I was divorced. And I had followed all of the quote-unquote rules in the Nation. And so I'm evaluating my life. And I still had so much dogma inside of me that there was a disconnect. And I think that what you describe in the question you ask is very valid for a listener, because a woman in one season of her life will hear one thing, but a woman in another season will hear something totally different.
That's
and
right.
So my statements reflect different phases of my young womanhood into, I would say, developmental. I think that when I was in the Nation, I was cut off to a degree. Even though I was sexual with my husband, flirtatious, I was mimicking probably what I had seen, which were women who owned a part of their sexuality, privately, of course, because that's not something that women in the mosque display. But I will tell you, it's a lot of horny women underneath those headpieces.
I can't recall when this was.
Right.
Two things. One, I used to work with the woman at Discovery Channel who said that she walked into her young child's room. She was 8, 9, 10, 11, somewhere around there, and saw her daughter gyrating on the bed. And she said to myself, okay, my daughter has found her clitoris. And she was like, baby, rubbing is what she called it. You can rub anytime you want. Just make sure the door is closed, and that's yours. So you can do that. No problem. Ain't no shame with that. If that's what you want to do, just make sure the door is closed when you do it. That's the first thing. The second thing is, there was a woman that was on the Oprah show, and I forget her name, but she was an expert in one of the things that women were expert at who went on there to talk about it. And she was talking about it. And she said that she teaches her daughter how to masturbate and to understand that that's a pleasure that she can give herself. So that the first time Dick and Harry that walk up on her, she ain't thinking he the best thing that ever happened. No, I know how to do that for me. That's owning your sexuality if you ask me.
That's
Right.
right. That's right. Absolutely.
That's right. But Robert, there it is. That's just it. Women, and that's what I think is brilliant in reading this book. We're never taught that bridge. Most of us aren't taught that bridge, I will say. You know, my mother was very open with me.
The reason is just because our mothers have had children, and even if they have a degree of sexualness to them, a lot of them have not had orgasms. As I began to own my own sexuality, I began to poll the older women in my life. And they didn't know. They didn't know what their clitoris was for.
They stopped at pleasure.
That's right. They didn't know that there were multi-levels to being orgasmic.
Right.
And so when you are parentified as a child, meaning sometimes children become so much like their parents or they're taking care of their parents and that type of thing, you don't have a real relationship where you're taught to have a conversation with your adult daughters a lot of times to where you share that part of yourself. And you'd be surprised at the women who are terrified to even have a human conversation with their mothers. And so that leaves women getting misinformed or attaching their sexuality, their orgasm to someone else, never themselves.
Exactly.
And attaching it to pleasure as opposed to opening it up. It goes so much more than pleasure. Attaching it to the human spirit that you are, or as
manifestation.
Exactly. Manifestation and talking to your womb, you know, and just the manifestation of your own glory. And to your point, I will share that I probably didn't learn this until my 30s. Because sex was all about, oh, wow, pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And if I had an orgasm, that was an extra bonus. But for me, it was really about pleasing the person that I was with.
Well, let me ask you sisters this. So when you had your first orgasm, Michelle or Tonia, whoever wants to speak on it, what did you learn from that first orgasm that you didn't know before?
Let Judy tell you.
I had my first orgasm very early. I discovered my clitoris probably before I was 10 years old.
Wow.
So just call it a gift. And I enjoy, I enjoyed my juicy very early.
You were doing this for your pleasure and for your own, the building of your own sensuality. You understood that?
Yes, indeed.
Wow.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And throughout my life, I tended to attract people who automatically, they saw in me my juicy, and they knew that they had to be about that in order to engage with me.
They needed to be juicy too.
If they couldn't cooperate, then there would not be any, you know what I'm saying, partaking.
I think Judy represents, I say this in the book as well, there are many faces to the goddess. And so there are women who are born with a sensual knowing, a sensual gift, this ability to be tapped into their sensuality and their orgasm very early. That woman usually still needs to be coached by a woman who owns hers. Why? Because a lot of times other women are afraid of that woman. And later on, she can be condemned to shame by her own peers, and then it sets up another dynamic in her life. I have coached many women who have always been full-figured, big onion before they were butt shots and all that. You know, women in the South were born this way. They naturally attracted men. They had this charm about them.
Right.
And usually, if their mother didn't do it, other women could shame them to the point where that woman takes on a whole nother persona. And so that type of woman also needs to have an elder, a big sister, to guide her in how to use it for her benefit. Because if she's not careful, other people will use it for theirs.
So, thank God that I didn't have those experiences. As I've grown older, and I'm, like I said, 58 years old now. So my juicy has come and gone because I'm at a different stage in my life, and I don't need to do all that right now. If I never use my juicy ever again, that's fine, because I've used mine more than most people ever have. But okay.
Well, we can talk about that, because you still have things you want to manifest, and juicy is part of that manifestation.
Part of that.
Yes.
Yeah, but right now my priorities are different in my life.
Judy, allow me to go back for 1 second, because I want listeners to understand. LaTonya, this is what I'm going to ask you to explain to us. I want listeners to understand what it is that we are literally, and Robert knows I always have to do this, what it is that we're talking about when we're saying manifesting that orgasm into the whole you.
And into what you want, into the vision that you have for your life and your relationships and all of that. Like juicy is a power. I think we can't forget that.
Exactly, and give more texture to that.
My initial orgasm, like full-blown, self-generated orgasm, came from a toy, because I had never played with the toy, and I didn't have a lot of success manually stimulating myself. And so the toy was like, oh, okay, really now?
Right.
Is this what I've been missing? Oh, okay. And so while I had enjoyed sex and certainly had some mild orgasms, the toy took it to another level. I just wasn't even aware of toys in that way. I had put the responsibility of my orgasm in the hands of my husband to a degree.
Right. Your orgasm was his responsibility.
Yeah. So I was usually turned on by a mate, a spouse, even before my husband. And, I mean, my turn-on was really a good one. I remember them little girl turn-ons, wet panties and all of that. So when I had that experience, it really just was delighted. It was so delightful. I just felt like I had discovered something for myself, by myself, with myself, physically, because it was another release that I just had not experienced at that level, especially alone. Mm-hmm. And I was late life. I had been married. Of course, I'd had boyfriends. I'd been quite fresh myself, but this was just another level, because it was not penetrative sex.
Right.
A lot of times, a lot of us only have known pleasure through penetration. And so to know that you can have pleasure and orgasm beyond that, that's how it happened for me. And it opened up a whole another level of discovery. Now, when we talk about juice as a power, of course, juice, when your car needs to have a jump start, you say, give me some juice. Mm-hmm. When you are turning your breaker box on, or you're testing to your electricity, they say, do I have any juice? So for me, juice began as a power. And so it is not about just orgasm and just sexuality. In fact, later, as I began to work in my rites of passage program, a lot of women would come initially chasing orgasm, just like I did. Any coach who's listening knows that you always attract more of yourself in the beginning. And so they came chasing orgasms, trying to see how they could keep a man, get a man, attract a man. These were heterosexual women.
Right.
And all the time, they were never dealing with the powerlessness that they had around their femininity. And so as I began to teach them in terms of the relationship between, first of all, love, sex, and money, they are actually governed by the same chakra energy, love, sex, and money. Mm-hmm. So if you're out of alignment in your love, your sex, or your money, most of the time, if you're out of alignment in one, you're out of alignment in one of the other. Mm-hmm. You can, or all of them. Mm-hmm. It's literally, it's not something I made up, and I started to see the pattern. So Juicy now has become more of an acronym for joyfully unraveling intimacy's creative yes. Joyfully unraveling intimacy's creative yes. Intimacy even is another word, just like pleasure, that is automatically attached to sex and romance. But on the spiritual level, especially the metaphysical level, intimacy is into me I see. Into me I see. If I can see me, I can share that part the same way I would sexually.
Exactly.
When the Bible talks about intercourse, it talks to know.
Right.
He knew her.
Right.
And so how can someone else know you if you don't know
Come
you?
on now, we teaching
So that is juicy for me. Juicy is much, much more. It is levels to this shit, as they say.
That's right.
You know, it levels
right.
to it. And so many of us stay on a baby food level.
Yes, we do.
Never graduated. It's so funny that you, Miss Judy, say this, and because you put it out there, I'm going to speak to it. I was just talking to my 74-year-old godmother, who I talk about in this book in Chapter 3, as a matter of fact. And she was talking about how women her age say things like you just said. I don't have time for that. I'm done with that. Because I said, well, Rita, why you don't pass this on? She said, I'm tired. She said, they're more focused on dying rather than living and experiencing. And so juicy is not about, I'm done with that. Juicy is how do I want to now reposition it in my life no matter what season I'm in. So that means it doesn't mean that I have to have intercourse. It means that I can now take my pleasure for me and pour it into my goals, pour it into my next level, pour it into my next season.
Let me actually let you know why I don't have time for it right now. It's because my energy is focused on my elderly mother, who I live with, my 83-year-old mother, who I'm caretaker for. And she's my energy now. You know, I've taken her through a whole lot in my years, and I got a lot of paying back to do. With our elderly parents, we don't know how much time they have left on this earth. And right now, I can give up my juicy because I can always go back to it. But I can't always go back to my mother. I'm not trading time.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, Judy. And just to put an exclamation point on that, and maybe a period or a comma, and then we can move on to the rest of our discussion.
Yep.
A lot of times the consciousness is and or consciousness. And that is what we're taught. That's part of the social program.
There you go.
The first step to enlightenment and wisdom is to lose that program. Delete is not and or. It's both consciousness. And that's when you get into the practice and perfection of balance and mastery. Now that's a different consciousness. So what is required from one consciousness to the next is graduation.
And that's the reason I asked the question, LaTonya, and thank you for that very informative kind of explanation of it, because that's exactly why I asked the question. Well, I asked it for a couple of reasons, for my own personal perspective, but I agree, Robert, you just put the period on it. We have this tendency from when we grow up and we experience that first level of pleasure as young girls, we have this tendency for it to be and or. And we're never taught that it could be a fluid part of our lives. I remember as a young girl, and it's so funny, Judy, when you talk about, or somebody mentioned about, you know, panties getting wet and stuff like that. I remember as a young girl, 4, 5, 6, whatever, when you start discovering yourself, you start playing around, and you're like, oh, that sounds good. As a 5 or 6-year-old, 7-year-old, you don't really know, right?
Right.
But then you don't know what that is. You just know it feels good. And just like Robert's example of your friend and whatnot, so, you know, you come home and you're rubbing yourself or whatever, you know, and you just know it feels good. For me, then at around 8, I started my period. And for me, then around 8 years old, 9 years old, I was the fat girl. Period and fat. Period and fat. Period and fat. Now, my mother was, at the same time, she was what I call mirror woman. She was our bodies ourselves. Take that mirror, know your parts. Look at. So my mother was very open with regards to your body parts and how they work. And I say that very specifically because this was not about sex. This was about me understanding my femaleness, my womanness, my body parts, and not to be ashamed of them. But what she didn't transfer, and I'm not saying it was her responsibility, just like you said, LaTonya, what most women don't do is explain how those body parts then work within the sensuality of your sexuality, you know, and that was not explained. And so at 8, I became stunted. I'm going back to this good girl thing because when I read The Good Girl and it blocks your flow, at 8 years old, due to my period, which then became the responsibility of womanhood, and then being called the fat girl and fat, I was the ugly girl. I became stunted by that good girl block. And so in reading your book, and I hope when women read it that they're able to then peel back their layers and see, because then the first time I had sex, it was not about my pleasure. It was about me pleasing him, and if I got a result, then I did good.
Yeah.
You know, if he came, I did good. I did good.
And that's where, actually, I had to shorten this book because there's a part of me that wanted to get deeper into more of the tantric understanding of things. Our sisterhoods out here in the collective just don't even have a basic understanding, because when you start to study tantra, sexual kung fu, and other layers, it's so not about the orgasm. In fact, to your point, Robert, when you said it's a both consciousness, and I say it this way, both and, not either or. Compartmentalizing happens very early in our life, and so sure, in late life, you will compartmentalize it as well. And here's how Audre Lorde says it. I want to read this quote really quickly to you because she inspires me. I consider her an ancestor that guides me in my work with the women. She says, we tend to think of the erotic as an easy, tantalizing sexual arousal. I speak of the erotic as the deepest life force, a force which moves us to living in a fundamental way. And she says at the very beginning of this work she does called Uses of the Erotic, there are many kinds of power, used and unused, acknowledged or otherwise. The erotic is a source within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or recognized feelings. So to me, it's not compartmentalized. In other words, my pleasure is a part of my self-care. My pleasure is a part of my medicine. My pleasure is a part of me being able to fill my cup so that I can give my cup. Because, see, there's too many women who are bitter and broken, but they're parenting. They're in leadership.
Right.
They're in the church. And it comes across. And so we'll be faithful to everything else and everyone else. And really, that's a form of disease. And this is why I like Dr. Christiane Northrup, because it does show up in the form of fibroid, tumors, breast cancer, these other breakdowns, because we are allowing ourselves to go unnurtured and unpleasured and just really not even acknowledged for long periods of time. And the layers of these conversations can go from religion to age to appropriateness and just all of these different things. The women who are, and men of course, who are sexually curious but feel guilt and shame, unhealed molestation trauma. Do you know how many sisters are walking around who have never had therapy, but they're leading women's movements?
That's the overall issue of unaddressed trauma in our community. Unaddressed trauma.
As a former English teacher in PG County and D.C. public schools, I had a lot of students, girls and boys, who had been raped, molested. And one thing that happened as a result is that they became very sexual. And a lot of times with the boys, they thought they became gay. And really they weren't gay, but because they had been molested or raped by men, it halted their sexual growth. They became very ashamed because these men approached them and, and raped them. They thought that they didn't have a choice as to what their sexual identity was. And the way that it affects the girls is they become very promiscuous. And so in long term, a lot of those girls will end up in strip clubs. They'll end up as prostitutes. They'll end up having 3, 4, 5, 6 kids. In some form of fashion, that might be called juicy, but it's not really.
That's not juicy at all.
That's not juicy.
Because that's not awareness.
Miss Judy, I still think you have juicy very much attached to the sexual act.
Yes.
And I have to correct it for the listener.
Yes.
Because everything you've said, even about yourself, is attached to the sexual act and not your personal power.
Come on, teach
so
this.
Just because a person is engaging in sexuality does not mean that they are turned on, that they're tuned in, or tapped into themselves.
There's no consciousness with
I know women who are sexual. I know women who have squirting orgasms, but have no pleasure, no attachment to their body.
That's a key word.
So, and I also want to say what you described is one type of symptom of molestation and trauma. And this is why I do appreciate you saying this, Michelle. The good girl is left out of the equation that you just mentioned, Miss Judy. Because, see, that's a socioeconomic status, the woman who ends up with 5 and 6 kids and the woman who ends up in strip clubs. Because the truth is, good girls come from middle-class backgrounds. The good girl ends up with infertility later in life because she's followed the rules so much.
Come on now.
And heard, don't you bring no babies to my house, that when it's time for her to open her womb on her choice, she doesn't even know she has a choice. So the good girl gets left out of the equation in this culture and in this society because she's not a stripper, because she's not on drugs. So if she doesn't have the bottom of the barrel story, a lot of good girls get ignored in this culture because she performs under the radar. She does not want to be punished. So she falls in line. She gets the good grades. She gets the college degree. She marries someone early. She has the 2.5 kids. She pays her bills on time. This is the good girl. See, the good girl is not the one who gets a lot of attention in this culture. We celebrate rags to riches stories. We celebrate stories of people who was once on drugs and no longer on them. We celebrate the strippers. Right now, this is a stripper culture that we're living in right now. The sacred whore is being celebrated on all levels and being rewarded. We got to know what we're looking at. And so what I'm saying is the good girl is not the one who necessarily has 5, 6 children and who ends up in the strip club. Not her. She's the woman who goes undetected by her family. I want y'all to understand that. Her family who doesn't even pay attention to her needs. Because as long as she is performing and conforming, she's all right with everybody.
I can totally understand that. It's almost a fall in line. And you so separate the sexuality from the who you are. And I would say that it wasn't until my 30s, I mean, I was having sex, but it wasn't until my 30s when I actually, and it's so funny, tried a toy, that I had a from head to toe body experience. And I was like, wow. And it wasn't like, so when people hear you, they say, oh, you know, you're masturbating with a toy and stuff like that. That's why I keep wanting you to hit it home that this is not about the purity of an orgasm. This is not about solely an orgasm. This is about that orgasm that I felt was from head to toe. It tingled. It opened me up from inside out. It wasn't from outside in. It wasn't from pleasure. It was like from inside out. It was like I felt like, wow, my womb opened up, my heart opened up, my spirit opened up.
I would like to say, when I had my first orgasm, which was at age 14, a couple of things happened. The first thing, of course, was pleasure. We've all talked about that. And this is a theme that I think has come up in this conversation, particularly with the exchange and interchange with Miss Judy and Miss Tonia. Of course, the first thing was pleasure at 14. And that was brought on by the process of me having the orgasm, right? So, of course, I felt pleasure. That's one aspect of it. That's baby food, pleasure. And that's some good-ass baby food, too, all right? The other okay, after the pleasure, even at 14, my second thought was, oh, shit, I can do this. I am one powerful motherfucker. Now, of course, at 14, I didn't think those words, but that's how I felt when I realized that I could do this. Now we're not talking about the body. We're talking about consciousness. My consciousness tapped into the fact that, oh, shit, I am one powerful motherfucker if I can do this. And make a baby on top of that. So my point is that there is a separation. We live in a duality.
Yes.
Part of it is body and the other part is consciousness. So I think what I heard Miss LaTonya responding to was the body comments you were making, Judy, with the pleasure. Whereas there's a whole level of consciousness that has to be attached to the body. That's what gives you power. You can be totally absent in the body and enjoy pleasure. LaTonya has spoken passionately about that. That goes back to the both and thank you for the and, sis, LaTonya, because I normally go with the both consciousness, but both and is exactly what it is. It's both and. One doesn't have to deny the other. Mastery is in the balance of all things. All things. Mastery is the balance.
And in Tantra, you can be tantric and literally move your kundalini higher through your breath and through your imagination and through other things. So, Miss Judy, when you say, you don't have time, that can be the things that can restore you. When I'm talking about juicy and I'm mentioning something like Tantra and other techniques, it's so much so not about intercourse in that you can literally hone in. Let's just say you do have a craving, but you can take that energy through your breath, through meditation, and bring those two together to re-energize your body so that you can be of better service to anyone that you're taking care of. So that's what I mean to say when I'm talking about how we can use it for our own health and wellness as well, so that we can continue to pour into whatever it is that we choose to pour into.
LaTonya, what I appreciate about your comments, sister, is that sometimes, and I say this with all due respect to all parties present and who are listening, and you've said this to me, LaTonya, in the context of some work that we've done in the television industry. You looked at me one day and said, "Teach us, sister. Teach us, sister." Because what I was telling you was education. It was food for your soul, and it taught you something. Sometimes we cannot be afraid to be taught. That's how you go from one consciousness to the next. And what I see you doing in this conversation is teaching. As smart as some of us are, and I include myself in this, there are times when a brother needs to be taught. That's how my consciousness expands. That's all we're doing here, is expanding one another's consciousness with the teaching that we've developed some mastery around. And Sister LaTonya has developed some mastery around this idea of juicy.
And I always think about the person who's listening, right? Because even though we're having a great spirited conversation, there's someone who's listening who's learning. They're learning and something is opening in them. I'm telling you, as I do this tour, I'm getting the feedback of women who know, but they just didn't know what. They didn't know how to position it for themselves. So I appreciate the contrast even in this dialogue, because it's healthy for someone else who's listening and learning.
It's very important. It's important to teach and to be teachable. And I would like to think of myself as a brother who comes to the table with some knowledge and some experience, but who is always teachable on anything. I'd like to see myself in that way. That's very important.
What is that about when you're speaking about moving that energy from the sensual into our body space and manifesting that into the who we are? There was something I read, you talked about the law of detachment. And I really love that. You said during the orgasm process, there's a detachment from reality as endorphins are released for our good. That's kind of what I was talking about in that orgasm with the toy, is that I felt these endorphins. That was the first time I felt like, wow, I am the shit.
Historically, cultures who were sexually free were the ones that were not able to be oppressed. There are implications to this energy, this endorphin, that is political, it is spiritual, emotional, and it is economic. Because when a person is free and you can't shame and guilt them, it's very difficult also to engage mind control. So there's a whole historical implication in terms of histories of pre-Constantine, when we operated in tribes. And the sexually free tribes were the ones that oftentimes were martyred. They were literally killed because they wouldn't stop certain practices that they were starting to deem inappropriate or bad. This is how we even get this whole thing from the church. It wasn't anything to do with God or Jesus or any of that, because God was very much in their practices. But when you cannot control these people, even now if we fast forward and we see that there's a political implication even to other people's sexual identity and that type of thing. Now, as far as endorphins literally are meant to support healing, because there are endorphins released through the 5 senses of being touched, of hearing certain things, hearing certain sounds, tasting certain foods. So when we talk about sensuality, we have to look at the root word of sense.
Yes.
Your senses. You have 5 senses. If you're disconnected from 5 senses, those are 5 gateways to yourself that you don't even know how to activate for your own healing.
Right.
And so imagine.
And we only start with 5. There are more.
We only start with 5. There are more. And so imagine when someone is blind, what happens? Another sense gets enhanced.
Right.
They can hear different. They can feel different. There's another thing that happens if you can't speak. Then there's something else that takes place. So there is an alchemy in terms of our 5 gateways. I like Dr. Christiane Northrup because she talks about how when she started to prescribe pleasure as medicine for women, that the woman who had no pleasure in her life or refused it did not heal as quickly as the one who did. So when I'm talking about pleasure, I'm talking about dancing. I'm talking about some forms of exercise, travel. I'm talking about engaging your joy. There are a lot of women who are depressed and functioning. Intimacy. You can be in a relationship and not intimate. Or you can be so intimate with someone and not sexual.
Be in a relationship. Yep, that's it.
And creative. Sometimes the more intellectual the mind, the less connected to the spirit or to their creativity.
Absolutely.
Because you've been taught.
Left-brainers.
That's right. Very difficult for certain concepts to even enter because you think you know. Now, when we talk about your yes, what are you saying yes to in your life versus many of us are so conditioned to say no so quickly and call that power. But that's the level of a 2-year-old.
5 senses are what we start with, okay? When you commit yourself to the spiritual path and you develop a daily spiritual discipline, you become extrasensory. It opens you up to the other senses that you are born with. The more you commit yourself to the spiritual path to study, to the world of the invisible, that's spirits. When you commit yourself to the spirit world, you become extrasensory. There are other senses. So if you're having a conversation with someone whose consciousness is confined to the 5 senses, they will be confounded by many of the things that are being said. So I'm encouraging our listeners to become extrasensory, to tap into what is already there in your innerverse, INNERVERSE. That is the world inside of you. That is your innerverse. And there are way more senses in there than the 5 that you were birthed with in this outer space that we all inhabit, called our reality.
When you get into sexuality, see, the woman benefits from releasing her amrita, or sexual fluid, fruitful essence, if you will, right? We benefit on all levels of releasing. In fact, it's not real healthy for us to go without for too long, truth be told. But
this is true.
For men, they are healthier and have more power by retaining their semen. So that's a graduated conversation of juicy, a graduated conversation of juice. So the 5 senses are the basics, right? In terms of our sensuality, is developing a relationship with them on a mind, body, and spirit level. Most people have the senses compartmentalized. And so when we're talking about manifestation, there are people who have desires. Some unmet desires, some dreams deferred, or just sometimes appropriate, where we put labels such as good or bad on these things. When you begin with where you are in your 5 senses on the mind, the body, and the spirit level, yes, okay, fine. The body is obvious. You may want to start there and look at how you engage it. But also, how do you engage it in your mind and your spirit? Because some of us, in truth, have heard things that are become perceptual filters for how we hear. Some of us have seen things that have become perceptual filters for how we see, and so on and so forth. And when you start to clean up and clear at that level, mind, body, and spirit, now you can open to yourself and say, here's what I want to do with it. Oh, here's what I desire to explore. You give yourself permission now on your terms and not on someone else's terms. Untreated trauma begins to take on all types of faces and experiences and expressions. And we think we're looking at one thing. Sometimes if that person just dealt with the basics, usually there's a story attached to one of those senses. And when you begin to do deeper healing work, unraveling that story from pain into pleasure, because see, black people, brown people, we have more of a relationship with pain than we do pleasure.
Come on now.
We will run to the altar around pain. We'll show up for workshops around pain. We want to hear about somebody else's pain. But when you start to talk about pleasure, there's all types of objections. And why is that?
Religion.
Because pleasure is a secret salt.
That's why.
It's a power keg. Yeah, absolutely. And so when you start to take away shame and guilt are the two emotions that can paralyze any human. When you can free and release, because we're on the equinox day, this is a good time to talk about releasing and surrendering certain things so that you can reprogram and reset yourself. When you begin to release shame and guilt in any area of your five senses, it opens you to activate other senses on the spiritual level. When I take women through a process, when we get through those first 5 areas, right, oftentimes these women have spiritual gifts that they never have engaged. And now when they give themselves permission without the shame and the guilt and the apology and the fear of loss, that if I show up fully, then I'm going to lose something, then it usually activates those businesses, new relationships, the ability to flirt, especially with the Me Too movement. Now that we have humans afraid to even engage with each other for fear of some type of punishment or that type of thing.
Shame and guilt. Let's go back to that. Very key. Shame and guilt, and this is a teaching for the brothers and sisters. Shame and guilt are dehydrating, not juicy.
Yes.
All right, let's be very clear. They are dehydrating. They dry you up. So the work on the path to juicy becomes dealing with the shame and guilt wherever they are present within your life and within your spirit and within your soul. That's your work.
I remember when I first came to this work, I was chasing an orgasm probably like most people, because most of us are functioning at the third dimensional consciousness, this dense survival, earth level. We were always trying to get something, get another thing. I was no different initially. And only when I started to work with master teachers, and the first thing they did was take sex right off the table, it totally took me right into me. That's where the intimacy comes from. My tantric practices helped me to develop such a direct relationship with God that I had never known in the nation, even in my metaphysical understanding, because metaphysicians can get stuck too. But to integrate the metaphysical and the spiritual into my body now, and that took me to another level of prayer. Like the body becomes a prayer through your breath. The body becomes a relationship with communication and how you communicate with the divine. So it really is already connected, and that's how come I kind of dropped Kundalini out there anyway. I want people to hear that word and get comfortable with a word like Kundalini, because it's all around us. But many of us are stuck on the root chakra level in survival mode, never uncoiling. Kundalini, for the listeners, is represented usually by the snake. Well, what we've been taught to fear snakes, right? And so that snake energy is just like our sexuality. We've been taught to fear it. It's no different. It's represented on so many levels, yet the snake energy is represented in medicine as that staff. The 2 snakes wrapped around the staff for medicine.
The caduceus. The caduceus.
Exactly.
Yep. The Kedusha.
Come on, Robert Wesley Branch.
You know, I got you.
Knows the proper name.
I got you, sis. But let's cause now when you dropped Kundalini earlier, I purposely did not follow up on it, because in consciousness, I know you and I are there. I also know that some of our listeners who started with us 10 years ago, Kundalini was not where I was until I had a spiritual awakening in 2012. When you begin to research the term Kundalini, brothers and sisters, it will lead you to a correspondence in your Christian belief system for those of you who are Christians. And the closest that you're going to get to the idea of Kundalini, which is a Eastern spirituality term, is in the Bible, the Christian Bible. It mentions Shekinah glory. Shekinah glory.
Yes.
Okay. Shekinah glory. And Shekinah glory is that fire that we sing about that shut up in my bones, right? And in Eastern spirituality, that fire is symbolized, as Sister Tonia said, 2 snakes coiling up your spine, which is the raising of your kundalini, your fire energy. Anytime you see the word fire, think spirit. Fire is spirit, right? Think of all your depictions of spirit in your MGM movies. There's some fire. The burning bush is a good example, comes to mind in a moment. That's what we're talking about when Latanya's talking about kundalini. There is a process for becoming aware of that and for consciously raising it up your spinal cord. That's a process. That's a masterclass that could take 40 years. And most people don't experience it because their consciousness is not graduated enough to be able to accept the changes that raised kundalini will cause in your body. It will kill some motherfuckers. If your kundalini was raised, you could die. And that's not a joke. There are people who die.
It's not a joke. It's not a game. Not a game. And that's to your point. There are people who jump into it, and you can unravel that kundalini before you've spiritually matured, before you've done the healing work to clear those stories, and even health issues. And that kundalini rises, it can cause an imbalance. And there are people who are walking around, and then they begin to misuse that particular energy for themselves and for other people. I'm so glad that you made that point, Robert, because there are a lot of secret sexual communities, swingers, and all kind of different things. You think that swingers, for instance, would have this type of understanding and don't. I've sat down and talked to people who are polyamorous, swingers, all types of things, and they have not done this level of healing in the area of the 5 senses. Therefore, are playing with high-level energy.
Yes.
And it blows them away.
That's
and
right.
It can blow the lid off of your relationships
yes, it
as
can.
well, and your ability to navigate here on Earth as well. So
there's also a process of harnessing. Once you've awakened the beast, you got to be able to harness that, or the beast that you've awakened will destroy you.
That's right.
It will destroy you. The beast that you woke up will destroy you. So you have to be able to harness that energy. Once you summon that power, you have to be able to harness it. And for what? For manifestation. That's why you have to have a vision. It all starts with the vision of who you want to be. What kind of person do I want to be? Why am I here? What is my mission? And once you get clear on what I perceive to be the foundational things like that, then when you begin these deeper processes of awakening these energies, you have some framework in which to harness that power that you're summoning. Without that framework, you are playing with fire for real.
And to your point, the anus is a gateway. And it also releases spirit, by the way.
Come on.
And so a lot of times what we see, what gets released, especially when it's done in a traumatic form, that's a great point to what you're talking about, because you can experience pleasure. Do you know, most people who have been molested are confused and conflicted because they've also experienced pleasure. And so when you talk about accessing the anus, there are a lot of young people who, us old heads need to know this. There are a lot of young people now who are doing oral sex or having anal sex and say, I'm still a virgin, but they're still engaging. And so now we have these children or young people who are over-sexualized, and they have opened the gateway. They have awakened something, and they don't know what it is. And sometimes it can be very dark, and it will show up in your life.
There are different schools of thought on this. Some of the visualizations show the coiled snakes sleeping in your sacral area. That's down by your anus. That's where they sleep. How they say in the Christian church, don't trouble the waters. Don't trouble the waters.
Yes.
Let them be. So you can trouble those waters with the kundalini at the wrong time, with the wrong consciousness, and get yourself into some trouble. However, that happens to many of us and has happened to many of us. Things have been disturbed prematurely. There are rituals and practices that can re-virginize you. The Bible speaks about this. I can take your crimson and make it white as snow. There are processes for regenerating that which has been stolen from you, or shit that you might have just given away along the road. Now, come on now. If we done given a lot of shit away in our lives. Come on now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you're not ruined. And that goes back to the scarlet letter.
The shame.
And when your sexual identity becomes now attached to a traumatic experience, and that happens on so many levels, from molestation to poor choices or acting outside of timing. And I guess I want everyone to hear is that you can heal that by choice now.
Yes, you can.
Not by force, but by choosing to say, I'm going to enter into this zone that I've compartmentalized. I'm taking it out of the box now. I'm unwrapping the present. Well, first of all, I need to see it as a gift, because when you can do that, you can have a different level of intimacy, a different level of creativity, and a different level of release right here in your own, according to your vision and your calling, your anointing.